Welcome to the Lectric Service Center. Today, we'll be showing you how to install the fenders and rear rack on a Lectric XPress. A quick note, this process will be exactly the same for both the high step and the step-through models of the Express. Before we begin, you'll need to make sure you have some tools ready to go. You'll need flush cutters, zip ties, an 8mm box wrench, a 4mm hex wrench, a hand ratchet, a torque wrench, a 17mm long socket, a Phillips head screwdriver, and a bag of hardware that came in the fender box. It will also help to make this installation with the bike on a bike stand. We will be starting with the installation of the fenders. If you are only installing the rear rack, you can skip ahead in this video. First, when you unpackage the fenders out of the box, you will have 2 assembled fenders in protective shipping material and a bag full of necessary hardware. You can go ahead and unpackage the fenders. A note, you might need to tighten the fender stay brackets before installation. Now, you can go ahead and rip the plastic cover off of each fender, revealing the material of the fender. A note, you may need to loosen the fender stay bracket on the rear fender in order to fully remove the plastic covering. Now, make sure to remove the battery from the Express. This will ensure that there is no current running through the bike as you work on it. We will be starting with the installation of the front fender. On the arch of the front fork, there is an M5 bolt that will be holding the fender tab in place. Remove that with a 4mm hex wrench. Once that bolt is removed, slide the fender in between the fork stanchions, making sure that the fender stays are oriented closer to the rear of the bike. Line up the fender tab that is located on the top of the fender with the hole on the arch of the front fork. Then, lightly screw the bolt back into the hole to hold the fender into place. Now, further down the fork lowers, there is a mounting point for the fender stays. Currently, inside that mounting point is a small dust cap that keeps the holes clean. Pull those plastic dust caps out of the holes. If you need, you can use a flathead screwdriver to help pry them out. Now, with the 2 M5 bolts that came in the hardware bag, screw the bolts through the fender stay loops into the mounting points on the fork lowers. Once those are tightened down, head back up to the fender hanging tab and pull the fender up so that it is not coming in contact with the tire. Finish tightening the bolt down. Give your wheel a spin to make sure that the fender is not rubbing on the tire. Now we will move on to installing the rear fender. To install the rear fender, you will need to remove the rear wheel, and in order to remove the rear wheel, you'll need to disconnect the motor cable. Using flush cutters, snip the zip tie holding the motor cable to the non-drive side chainstay. Now, unplug the motor cable. Next, you'll need to remove the derailleur guard and torque arm. On the dropout, there's an M5 bolt screwed in through the torque arm. Remove the bolt with a 4mm hex wrench. Repeat this process on the opposite side of the bike. However, there will not be a derailleur guard on the non-drive side of the bike. Now, using a hand ratchet and a 17mm long socket, loosen the axle nuts, allowing the rear wheel to drop out of the dropouts. We recommend keeping the axle nuts on the axle, but if you need to remove it to drop the wheel out of the dropouts, that is okay. Now, you'll be attaching the rear fender to the frame of the bike. On the rear fender, there are two holes that will line up with the two mounting points on the frame of the bike. On the inside of the frame of the bike, there are two mounting points for the fender, one on the back side of the bottom bracket and one on the back side of the seat tube. Line the two holes on the rear fender with the two mounting points on the inside of the frame of the bike. Then, screw in the two Phillips head screws that came with your fenders. Now, down at the rear dropouts, there are two holes. The fender stays will need to be screwed into the top hole. Place a bolt through the hole in the fender stay and the top hole on the rear dropout and screw it in. Repeat this process on the opposite side of the bike, and your fenders are installed. Now we will be installing the rear rack. Installing the rear rack also requires the rear wheel to be removed. If you are not installing the rear rack, you can skip ahead to the rear wheel installation. Before you install the rear rack, you will need to remove the rear light. Snip the two zip ties that are holding the rear light cable to the cable bosses on the drive side of the frame. Then unplug the light cable. Now, using a 4mm hex wrench, unscrew the two M5 bolts that are mounting the rear light bar to the frame of the bike. You will be mounting the stock rear light to the rear rack. Using an 8mm box wrench, unscrew the two nuts on the backside of the light bar. There are also lock washers under the nuts. Make sure to keep track of these. Pull the rear light from the light bar. Once you have removed the rear light from the light bar, you will need to mount it onto the light mounting bracket on the backside of the rear rack. Place the two mount posts through the two holes on the light mounting bracket and the cable through the cable cutout. Now, using an 8mm hex wrench, screw the lock washers and nuts back onto the mount posts. In the bag of hardware, you will have also received a light extension cable. You will be plugging that in now. If you do not plug in the light extension cable, the stock cable will not reach, and you will be unable to use your rear light. Once you have plugged in the rear light extension cable, zip tie the cable to its designated cable bosses on the inside of the rear rack. Make sure to snip the excess. Now, back on the bike, line the 4 mounting holes up with the 4 mounting points on the frame of the bike. Make sure the rear light is facing the rear of the bike. When the holes are lined up, use a 4mm hex wrench to screw in the 4 M4 mounting bolts. If you have a rear fender installed, you will need to line up the hole on the top of the fender with the hole on the underside of the rear rack. Line that hole up and screw on one of the Phillips head screws that came with the rack with the Phillips head screwdriver. Finally, you will need to reinstall the rear wheel. Line the rear axle up with the rear dropouts. Then, slide the rear axle into the dropouts. In order for the wheel to fit into the rear dropouts correctly, you will need to make sure that the axle components are in the right order. The correct order is as follows. From outside in, the order will be axle nut, lock washer, derailleur guard, and torque arm. Then, on the inside of the dropout, there will be a notched washer, with the notch placed within the bottom cutout of the dropout. This will be the same on both sides, except for the derailleur guard on the non-drive side. Lightly screw on the axle nut. Place the bike on the ground if it is not already. You will now be tightening the rear wheel. Tightening it on the ground will ensure that the axle is correctly seated within the dropout. Screw the M4 bolt into the torque arm on both sides with a 4mm hex wrench. Then, using a 17mm long socket and a hand ratchet, tighten the axle nut down loosely, but don't tighten it down all the way as you'll need to torque it to spec. Using a 17mm long socket and a torque wrench, torque the axle nut down to 35 Nm. Now, plug the motor cable back in. Zip tie the cables to the two designated cable bosses, one on the underside of the chainstay and one on the inside of the chainstay. Snip the excess. Now, run the extended light cable along the non-drive side seat stay and through the seat stay brace. Then, zip tie the cable to the rear rack here. Snip the excess. Now, on the drive side of the bike, plug the extended light cable into its corresponding cable. Located on the seat tube, there are two cable bosses. Zip tie the cable to those cable bosses. Make sure to snip the excess of all the zip ties, and your Express is ready to go. Don't forget to put the battery back in the bike. If you have any questions about this process, please feel free to reach out to our customer support team at contact@lectricebikes.com or give us a call at 602-715-0907. Thanks for watching.